beloved. Today I will continue the series of stories about macabre encounters. From Tinder, get ready, grab your headphones, crucifix and holy water. Today I will tell you a story about a young man who accepted an invitation from a mysterious woman he met online to meet at a cafe. What seemed to be the beginning of a romance soon turned into a terrifying experience when he realizes that the woman is keeping secrets that defy logic. Take advantage now, like it, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell so that YouTube notifies you of new stories, and so that you can recommend the channel to more people. Some people stand out not because of their looks or the words they say, but because of the feeling they leave you with, a mix of fascination and discomfort. When Kyle told me his story, he wasn't the same confident young man who had gone into that meeting. He was scarred, haunted by something that even he couldn't fully explain. Kyle was 25 years old, living alone in a small apartment in the city center, and leading a quiet life. He was an ordinary guy, balancing his office job with a modest social circle. Despite being sociable, loneliness would follow him at unexpected times, like rainy nights or empty weekends. It was this loneliness that led him to explore dating apps. He used to say that he didn't expect much from these encounters. They were more distractions than real opportunities to find something meaningful. Until he met Clara. Clara showed up on Tinder like any other profile, but there was something about her that intrigued him. Her photos were different from the norm, no forced poses or excessive selfies. Instead, there were images of her in serene locations, an open field, an old library, a bridge in an unfamiliar city. Everything seemed carefully chosen to evoke mystery. When he started chatting, Kyle was immediately hooked. She was intelligent, with a subtle sense of humor that made her conversations long and engaging. She enjoyed books and art, and seemed to have a unique perspective on almost everything. There was one thing that was peculiar, though. Clara kept talking about herself. When Kyle asked her about her work or her family, she changed the subject so subtly that he almost didn't notice. After weeks of exchanging messages, Clara suggested they meet in person. "Let's go somewhere quiet," she wrote. "I know a cafe you'll love." Kyle agreed, feeling both excited and nervous. The cafe was located in the city center, but on a quiet street. When he arrived on the appointed day, the atmosphere of the place seemed perfectly suited to Clara's personality. It was small, with walls lined with shelves of old books, vintage furniture, and instrumental music playing in the background. Clara was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She waved at Kyle, smiling. She was even more beautiful in person, but not in an obvious way. Her beauty was delicate, almost ethereal, as if she didn't quite belong there. They started talking, and it all seemed natural at first. Clara had a knack for asking questions that went beyond the surface, which got Kyle thinking about things he wouldn't normally think about. She talked about trips she wanted to take, books she loved, and even her theories about existence. "Do you believe that people come into our lives for a purpose?" she asked at one point. Kyle replied that he'd never really thought about it, but Clara just looked at him and said, "You should." However, as the conversation progressed, Kyle began to notice little details that made him uncomfortable. First, Clara avoided answering questions about herself. When he asked her where she lived, she laughed and said, "Not too far from here." When he talked about her family, she just shrugged and changed the subject. It was as if Clara was there to find out everything about him, without revealing anything about herself. Then there was the way she looked at him. Her eyes were intense, but not in a romantic way. It was like she was studying him, as if every word and every movement were being recorded and detailed. It made him uneasy, but he ignored it, thinking that maybe it was just his imagination. When Kyle did so, Clara suggested, almost disappointedly, "It was great meeting you," she said. "I hope we can see each other again." She took a piece of paper from her pocket and wrote something quickly. "Here's my address. Next time, come to my apartment. It's more intimate." Kyle took the paper, thanked her, and left the cafe. As he walked home, he couldn't stop thinking about Clara. She was fascinating, but there was also something strange about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. When he got home, he picked up the piece of paper and read the address again. It was an old building in a less busy part of town, a place he didn't know. Out of curiosity, he decided to search for the address online. What he found was peculiar. The building was a historic structure, known for being home to writers and artists in decades past. However, in recent years it had gained a dark reputation. Stories of disappearances, unexplained sounds, and even strange figures in the windows were common. Kyle read the reports, feeling a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't stop thinking about Clara. Doubt began to eat away at him. Should he accept the invitation? Something inside him told him not to go, but another part, more curious and impulsive, told him not to miss the opportunity to get to know this enigmatic woman better. That night, Kyle texted Clara. He wrote, "I think I accepted the invitation. See you on Saturday." As he waited for the answer, he felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. When Clara responded with just, "I'll be waiting," Kyle didn't know he had just made the worst decision of his life. Saturday came too quickly. Kyle was nervous, but he tried to ignore the feeling of uneasiness that had accompanied him since accepting Clara's invitation. He got ready for the date, wore a casual but tidy outfit, and left the house at dusk. The address on the piece of paper was still in his pocket, like a note guiding him to something meaningful. When he reached the building, Kyle stopped to look around. It was an imposing but old structure. The dark brick walls showed signs of wear and tear, and the windows were large with wooden frames that looked almost Gothic. Some of the windows had lights on, but most were dark, reflecting the cloudy sky above. He hesitated before entering, but eventually took a deep breath and walked forward. The inside of the building was as silent as the outside. The lobby had worn marble floors and a staircase that wound up to the upper floors. There was no doorman, no one to greet him, just the muffled sound of his own footsteps echoing through the empty space. He climbed up to the third floor, where Clara had said she had purchased her apartment. When he found the door, he noticed that it was different from the others. It was made of heavy wood, with a number engraved on a metal plate that looked older than the building itself. He knocked 3 times and waited. For a moment I thought no one would answer, but then the door slowly opened, revealing Clara. She opened it, looking unconcerned, and yet as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You came," she said, opening the door all the way. Kyle stepped inside, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down his spine. Clara's apartment was exactly as he had imagined, filled with antique furniture, stacks of books, and quirky decor that blended vintage with eccentricity. The windows were huge and had no curtains, allowing dim light to stream in, but that didn't make the space any more welcoming. In fact, everything felt cold. "Do you like it?" Clara asked, gesturing to the room. "It's not very modern, but it's full of history." Kyle forced a smile. "Yes, it's different." Clara offered him wine, and Kyle accepted, more to break the uncomfortable silence than because he actually wanted to drink it. They sat on the couch, and she began to chat as she had in the cafe, but there was something different this time. Her questions were more direct, almost invasive. "You live alone, right?" she said casually, toying with her wine glass. Kyle nodded, but began to feel a little uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was going. She continued, "Have you told anyone that you're here with me today?" Kyle hesitated before answering. "No, why?" Clara gave a smile that held nothing warm. "Oh, I'm just curious. It's nice to know you trust me." The silence that fell was suffocating. Kyle tried to change the subject, but found that Clara was staring at him. It was a strange look, as if she was studying every detail of his face. He looked away, feeling awkward. Suddenly she declared herself. "Come," she said, gesturing for him to follow her. "I want to show you something." Kyle reluctantly followed, trying to appear calm. She led him to one of the large windows. The building overlooked a quiet street, but the reflection in the window caught Kyle's attention. For a moment, he thought he saw something strange, a silhouette that shouldn't have been there, standing behind them. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. "Did you see?" Clara said, still looking out the window. Kyle tried to hide his discomfort. "Did you see what?" She turned to him with an enigmatic smile. "Nothing. Sometimes I think I see things too." Kyle began to feel like he needed to get out of there, but before he could make up an excuse, Clara stood up. She grabbed his arm, her eyes fixed on his. "Do you believe that people can change?" she said, her voice low and almost hypnotic. Kyle tried to respond, but something made him stop. He felt like he was trapped in that gaze, like Clara was sucking all his energy out of him just by her presence. Finally, he pulled away, shaking his head. "Look, I think I should go," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Clara didn't look surprised, but something changed in her expression. She stepped back, allowing him to pass. "Okay," she said calmly, "but come back. Any day. I'll be here." Kyle left the apartment, feeling relieved to be out of Dali, but not completely at peace. Something about that night was bothering him, and he couldn't explain what it was. When he got home, he took a hot shower, trying to erase the heavy feeling he was carrying. But it was during the night that the real terror began. Kyle woke up around 2 a.m., feeling strange. The room was dark, but something was off. He picked up his phone to check the time and noticed something that made him freeze. On his phone's camera, as he adjusted the screen brightness, a shadow flashed behind him. He turned around immediately, but there was nothing there. Trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination, he went back to bed, but he couldn't sleep. In the morning, he noticed something even stranger. His bedroom window was open, even though he was sure he closed it before going to sleep. In the following days, small things happened. He felt that he was being watched, even inside his house. Objects moved around, and the feeling that he was not alone became constant. It all culminated one night when he heard a light tapping on his bedroom window. When he got up to check, he saw something that terrified him. Clara was on the other side of the glass, looking at him with that same enigmatic smile. Clara's face was there on the other side of the window, frozen in a smile that conveyed not joy, but something much darker. Kyle instinctively recoiled, stumbling into the chair next to his bed. Panic gripped his body as his mind struggled to process what he saw. "That's not possible," he whispered to himself, trying to believe that his eyes were playing tricks on him. He was on the 3rd floor of a building, and there was no balcony or place for anyone to lean on outside that window. But Clara didn't seem to care about the laws of physics. Her eyes were fixed on him, and her smile didn't fade. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and tapped lightly on the glass, as if asking to come in. Kyle grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to call the police. Before he could complete the call, the screen went blank. He tried to turn it back on, but it was as if the device had died in his hands. As he fought against despair, Kyle witnessed something even more frightening, the sound of muffled laughter, as if Clara were laughing but not opening her mouth. The laughter seemed to come from all sides, filling the room. He covered his ears, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was as if it were inside his head. The knocking on the window grew louder. Kyle looked again, and this time Clara was no longer alone. There were other silhouettes beside her, faceless shadows that emanated an oppressive energy. Their bodies were shapeless, but their eyes glowed with a faint light, like embers about to die out. Kyle finally managed to move. He ran to his bedroom door, throwing it open with such force that it nearly ripped off its hinges. He ran down the hallway of his apartment, tripping over his own feet as the laughter continued to haunt him, now echoing through the empty hallways. When he reached the living room, I tried the front door, but the lock seemed stuck. He turned the knob as hard as he could, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the sound I had feared most, footsteps coming from the hallway behind him. He turned slowly, and there was Clara, standing in the doorway of the room. The smile was still on her face, but now her eyes were completely black, devoid of any human features. The shadows that had previously been outside the window began to materialize behind her, filling the room with a suffocating presence. "Why are you running, Kyle?" Clara said, her voice soft but distorted, as if spoken by several people at once. "I told you I'd always be here." Kyle grabbed the first thing he could find, a desk lamp, and threw it at Clara. It flew past her and landed on the floor with a loud crash, missing her. Clara took a step forward, and the shadows moved with her, as if they were part of her body. "You can't run away from me," she said, her voice now coming from every corner of the room. "You let me in when you accepted my invitation. Now you belong to me." Kyle tried to back away, but he tripped over a chair and fell to the floor. Clara crouched down beside him. Her cold hand touched Kyle's face, and he felt a wave of numbness wash over his body. He wanted to scream, but his voice seemed to be stuck in his throat. "It's always like this," Clara muttered, almost to herself. "They always fight at first, but in the end, they all surrender." Kyle managed to gather his last strength and pushed Clara, getting up with difficulty. He ran to the living room window, breaking the glass with a chair. Without thinking twice, he jumped outside, falling onto the lawn 3 floors below. The pain remained throughout his body, but he was alive. He tried to get up, but something stopped him. He looked up at the window he had jumped from and saw Clara watching him. The smile on her face now seemed wider, almost impossible for a human face. "You will never escape," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. "I will always find you." Kyle staggered to the street and was helped by a passing taxi driver. He tried to explain what had happened, but his words came out slurred. The driver took him to the hospital, where he was treated for multiple fractures and minor injuries. At the hospital, Kyle was treated by doctors, but his mental state was more concerning than his physical injuries. He was shaken, repeating incoherent phrases about Clara, such as shadows and the window. The staff tried to calm him down, but his paranoia was evident. He insisted on keeping the lights on and constantly asked them to check the windows in his room. The police were called, and Kyle tried to explain what had happened. However, his story was absurd. When officers searched his apartment, they found signs of a struggle, broken glass, displaced furniture, but no sign of Clara or the shadows. More disturbing, neighbors denied seeing anyone entering or leaving the building that night. When police searched the building at Clara's address, they found a place that had been abandoned for years. The apartment Kyle claimed to have gone to was completely empty, covered in dust, and showed no signs of recent occupancy. There was no record of anyone named Clara living there, nor any evidence that she had ever existed. Kyle, however, knew it was all real. He spent weeks in the hospital, fighting the nightmares that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He would see Clara, standing outside the window, watching him with that unmistakable smile. Sometimes she was closer, in the doorway, in the corner of the room, or even beside his bed. The doctors attributed it to trauma and hallucinations, but Kyle knew it was more than that. Clara wasn't a figment of his mind. She was real, and she was hunting him. When he was finally discharged, Kyle moved to another city, trying to leave everything behind. He avoided windows and always double-checked that doors were locked. He refused to use dating apps and avoided any place that might remind him of Clara. However, the fear never completely left him. One night, as he was walking home, he felt that he was being followed. He looked back, but the street was empty. He quickened his pace, his heart racing. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door and threw himself on the couch, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. Then he saw. In the reflection of the switched-off television, Clara stood behind him. Her smile was bigger than ever, and her eyes, completely black, wanted to devour him. Before he could react, she whispered in his ear, "I told you I would always be here." Kyle spoke and turned around, but the apartment was empty. He ran to the door, but it didn't open. The lights began to flicker, and he heard the muffled laughter again, the same one he had heard that night in Clara's building. What happened to Kyle after that night remained a mystery. When the police were called by neighbors who heard screaming, they found his apartment empty. There were no signs of a struggle, but the place was completely cold, as if no one had been there for days. The case was dismissed as just another unexplained disappearance, but to those who listened to her story, one thing is certain: Clara is still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to fall into her trap. And for you who are listening to this right now, be careful who you hang out with in your life, especially if they invite you to a place where the windows never close. Tomorrow, I'll be back with another chilling story from the series Macabre Tinder Encounters. May God be with you, my beloved, and see you tomorrow.